As the lights flicker and the sterile air of a medical lab settles like a heavy curtain over the room, an unsettling question lingers in the minds of those present. What happens the moment we die? Is there a fleeting moment of awareness, or do we simply slip into the abyss, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell? The year is 1887, and the world is on the cusp of scientific breakthroughs that will change history. But this experiment, this unorthodox endeavor to measure something as intangible and unfathomable as consciousness itself, will challenge the boundaries of science and morality in ways no one could have anticipated. It begins in Zurich, a city known for its beauty and intellectual vitality, yet beneath its picturesque surface, the air is thick with mystery. It's an age when science and superstition often walk hand in hand. The medical world, still groping its way through the darkened corridors of the human mind and body, has made strides, but the nature of consciousness, the very thing that defines us as human, remains an enigma. Doctors know the mechanics of life, heartbeat, pulse, breath, but the essence of consciousness, the spark of awareness that flickers within each of us, eludes them. And death? Well, death has always been a matter of faith, of ritual and belief. No one truly knows what happens in that final moment when the soul departs. It's a mystery, one that has haunted humanity since the dawn of time. But Dr. Ludwig Schmid, a man driven by an obsession as dark as it is fascinating, decides to take on this age-old question, not with prayers or philosophy, but with the cold, methodical tools of science. He was a man who viewed the world through the lens of experimentation, his curiosity a fire that burned too brightly to be ignored. Schmid was not the sort to accept the comforting answers that religion and tradition offered. No, he was a scientist, a seeker of truth, no matter how elusive, no matter how dangerous. And for him, the question was clear. Can consciousness be measured? Can it be observed, even after death? What happens when life slips away and death claims its due? These questions, too powerful to ignore, gnawed at him relentlessly. He understood that the mere act of death, with its finality and its shroud of mystery, was too vast a subject to be left to speculation alone. He had the mind of a rationalist, the kind of mind that wanted data, evidence, something concrete to prove or disprove the unfathomable. Yet, how could one measure something so ephemeral, so profoundly intangible as consciousness? The answer, as Schmid saw it, lay in one simple but startling hypothesis. The human body might experience a measurable change the moment consciousness departs, the instant life itself slips away. With the energy of a man possessed, Schmid set out to test this theory. The idea was groundbreaking, audacious, an experiment that defied the limits of what was scientifically acceptable. But there were no easy answers to be found in books or journals. No one had ever seriously attempted such an experiment before. He would have to pioneer this journey himself, facing ridicule, skepticism, and perhaps even the wrath of his peers. But Dr. Schmid was undeterred. His mind was set. This was no mere curiosity. It was a pursuit that he believed could change the course of science forever. In his lab, Schmid gathered the tools he needed. The year was 1887, and the medical world was just beginning to harness the power of rudimentary instruments, scales, thermometers, even early forms of the stethoscope. Though technology was far from advanced, Schmid had enough understanding to know that he could measure the weight of the human body with accuracy. And so, the plan began to take shape. If the body lost weight at the moment of death, it could provide a clue. Could the soul, as some had theorized, be the very essence of this weight? Was it possible that consciousness had a physical presence, something that could be seen and measured? It is easy, looking back from the comfort of modern understanding, to dismiss Schmid's theories as naive, his methods crude. But in 1887, this was the frontier of scientific inquiry. The rules of research were still in their infancy, and many in the medical field were as willing to entertain radical ideas as they were to reject them. Schmid knew that his experiment would be met with skepticism. No one had ever even attempted to measure consciousness, let alone after death, but his conviction was unwavering. He believed he was on the brink of something monumental, something that could not only change the course of medicine but might also unlock one of the greatest mysteries of human existence. As Schmid worked, the tension in the air seemed to grow heavier. The idea of measuring consciousness was so audacious, so mind-boggling, that it became more than just a scientific experiment. It became a confrontation with the very nature of life and death itself. The implications were staggering. If Schmid succeeded, he would have done what no one had dared attempt. He would have ventured into the realm of the unknown, attempting to answer questions that had tormented philosophers, theologians, and scientists for centuries. What happens after death? Where does consciousness go? Is there a measurable difference between life and death? But as Schmid moved closer to his goal, the doubts began to creep in. Even as he gathered subjects for his experiment, there was a sense of unease, a creeping sense of the forbidden. Could this be tampering with the very fabric of life and death? There were those who warned him that some things were better left unanswered, that some questions should never be asked. But Schmid, determined to push forward, ignored the warnings. His mind focused solely on the data he would gather, the results he would record. His subjects, after all, were willing volunteers, those who were prepared to lay their lives on the line for the chance to be a part of something revolutionary. The day of the first test arrived, and the atmosphere in Schmid's lab was thick with anticipation. The volunteers, drawn from various walks of life, arrived with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Some were medical professionals themselves, intrigued by the possibility that Schmid's experiment could unlock new knowledge of the human condition. Others were simply desperate men and women, seeking a way to make a mark on history, to leave behind a legacy that would outlast their lives. Whatever their reasons, they were all aware of the risks. Death, after all, was an unpredictable thing. But Schmid reassured them, promising that his methods would yield answers that could forever change the way the world understood death. As Schmid stood in the shadows, watching the first volunteer prepare for the experiment, the air seemed to grow thick with an uneasy silence. The moment of death was nearing, the moment when consciousness would either slip away unnoticed or leave behind some trace, some indication that it was more than just the end of a physical process. Schmid's heart raced as he watched the volunteer close their eyes for the final time. The moment was upon them, the moment that would either prove or disprove the audacity of Schmid's theory. And then, as the volunteer took their last breath, the room fell silent. The experiment had begun, and with it, the mystery of life and death would either be solved or remain forever beyond human reach. Would Schmid's theories stand up to the test of death itself, or would the darkness of the unknown swallow the answers whole? Only time would tell, but as the experiment unfolded, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. As Schmid peered at the instruments before him, the scale, the thermometers, the clock ticking in the background, he wondered if the answers would finally reveal themselves. But even in this moment, amidst the cold, scientific precision, there was a haunting thought lingering in the back of his mind. Could humanity truly measure consciousness? Could science ever reach the realms that had long been occupied by faith, philosophy, and the supernatural? This was the real question, one that would challenge not just Schmid, but every scientist, philosopher, and believer who dared to wonder about the true nature of life and death. The pursuit of answers was underway, but the journey, as always, was fraught with uncertainty. With the weight of history pressing upon him, Schmid braced for the revelations to come. Whatever the results, they would either confirm his darkest fears or ignite the flames of discovery that could light the way for future generations. And as the first signs of death took hold of his volunteer, Schmid realized that what he was about to witness was not just the end of life, but the beginning of a question that would echo across time, forever challenging our understanding of what it means to be alive. Zurich, 1887, a city teeming with intellectual energy, yet shadowed by the mysteries of life and death. In the late 19th century, the world was caught between two powerful forces: the rise of modern science and the deeply rooted traditions of faith and spirituality. In this volatile intersection of old and new, Zurich stood as a microcosm of the age, a place where the future was being written, yet the past still held strong, its ancient questions about life, death, and the soul lingering like specters over the city. It was an era defined by progress, industrialization, medical advancements, the spread of education, but it was also a time of deep existential uncertainty. While the Enlightenment had ushered in an era of rationalism, the mysteries of the human soul and the afterlife had remained tantalizingly out of reach, untouched by the cold hand of logic. The Swiss city, known for its intellectual heritage and its proximity to key scientific movements, was brimming with ideas and discoveries, yet much about the human experience remained elusive. Medical science, though advancing, had only just begun to understand the intricate workings of the body. Anatomy was no longer an arcane mystery, yet the essence of life itself, the very force that propelled the body and mind, remained unknown. The nature of consciousness, that invisible force that allows humans to be aware of themselves and the world around them, was still considered one of the greatest enigmas of existence. It was a concept that could be described, theorized, and argued about, but never truly understood. While the body could be dissected, catalogued, and studied in all its complexity, consciousness remained an elusive phenomenon, an intangible essence that slipped through the fingers of science. At the same time, Zurich was a city where the spiritual traditions of Europe had long held sway. Theories about the soul, the afterlife, and the eternal nature of consciousness were rooted in centuries of religious thought. Christianity, in particular, had shaped the worldview of many across the continent. In this religious context, death was often seen not as the end, but as a passage into another realm, a transition from the material world to the divine. The soul was believed to be eternal, and upon death, it was said to return to God or to some form of afterlife. This concept of the soul, which had been the subject of theological debate for millennia, stood in stark contrast to the emerging scientific understanding of the world. While the religious explanations offered comfort to the faithful, they were, to the more scientifically inclined, nothing more than speculative fiction. Yet, in the midst of these competing views, Zurich was also home to a new generation of thinkers, scientists, doctors, and intellectuals, who were determined to challenge the old paradigms and uncover the hidden truths of existence. The prevailing belief was that science, not religion, held the key to understanding the world. For them, the answers to the most profound questions about life, death, and consciousness could be found through careful observation, experimentation, and reason. It was a time when the boundaries of scientific inquiry were rapidly expanding, and nothing seemed impossible. New theories about evolution, electricity, and the laws of nature were being proposed, and the scientific community was excited by the prospect of discovering more about the forces that govern the universe. The idea that the human body and mind could one day be fully understood and explained through science was a thrilling prospect for many. In this context, Zurich was a fertile ground for radical ideas and daring experiments. The city was home to a burgeoning medical community, with universities and hospitals at the forefront of research. It was a place where new discoveries were not just expected, they were celebrated. Yet despite this atmosphere of intellectual curiosity and progress, the great question about the nature of consciousness remained unanswered. And so, it was in this environment, this collision of scientific ambition and spiritual uncertainty, that Dr. Ludwig Schmid, a man driven by a singular obsession, began to formulate his controversial experiment. Dr. Schmid was not a man to be easily swayed by the conventions of his time. He was a scientist of uncommon ambition, and while others were content with studying the mechanics of the body, Schmid sought something far more elusive, the soul, or more specifically, consciousness. For him, the traditional answers were insufficient. He could not accept the notion that consciousness was simply a product of the physical brain, nor could he reconcile the idea that death was merely the cessation of bodily functions. To Schmid, death was not a simple process. It was the moment when life, energy, and awareness departed from the body, leaving behind a lifeless vessel. But where did this awareness go? Was it truly extinguished, or did it continue in some form? Schmid's thinking was radical for his time. While others were content to accept death as an unknowable event, he believed it was a phenomenon that could, and should, be studied. His desire to measure consciousness was born from a deep intellectual curiosity and a personal drive to understand what lay beyond the veil of death. Schmid's approach was informed by the prevailing scientific ideas of his time, but it also reflected his own deep-seated belief that the soul, or at least the essence of consciousness, might leave a trace, a measurable residue, at the moment of death. He envisioned an experiment that would measure this trace, using the tools of science to pierce the veil that separated life from death. At the time, the idea of measuring consciousness was not entirely foreign. The field of psychology, in its infancy, had begun to explore the nature of the mind. Ideas about the connection between the brain and consciousness were being developed, and advances in neurophysiology were slowly unveiling the inner workings of the human nervous system. Yet even as these discoveries were being made, the question of what consciousness truly was, how it emerged and how it could be quantified, remained a mystery. Schmid, however, was determined to push beyond the limitations of the scientific knowledge of his time. He saw himself as a pioneer, a man on the brink of uncovering one of the greatest mysteries of human existence. But Schmid's idea was not without its critics. The scientific community was not yet ready to entertain the notion that consciousness could be measured, let alone after death. To many, Schmid's experiment seemed nothing more than a fanciful dream, a reckless pursuit of the unattainable. The ethical concerns were also significant. Death was, and still is, a deeply personal and sensitive matter. The idea of subjecting a person to an experiment in which death was not just anticipated, but actively induced, was considered morally repugnant by many. Schmid would have known that he was venturing into dangerous territory, both scientifically and ethically. But his drive to understand, to know, to measure the intangible, was too strong to ignore. Despite these challenges, Schmid persisted. The growing interest in understanding the human body and mind made Zurich a hotbed for experimentation, and Schmid saw this as his opportunity. He was not alone in his desire to unlock the mysteries of the human condition. In fact, the late 19th century was a time of great scientific fervor, when many thinkers were drawn to questions of the afterlife, immortality, and the nature of existence. The idea of studying death was not new. In fact, it had been a topic of interest for centuries. Yet no one had ever dared attempt to measure consciousness itself, and certainly not in the way Schmid envisioned. The city of Zurich, with its intellectual vibrancy and its commitment to scientific exploration, was the perfect place for such an audacious endeavor. It was a city that believed in progress, in the potential of human knowledge to break through the darkness of the unknown. But even as Schmid prepared for the experiment, he could not have known how it would change the course of his life, nor how the questions it raised would haunt those who came after him. In many ways, Zurich itself seemed to embody the tension between the known and the unknown. The city had long been a place where tradition and innovation coexisted, where the old ways met the new. Schmid's experiment was the perfect reflection of this paradox. It was a scientific endeavor, yet it was also deeply philosophical, a quest not only to measure consciousness but to understand what it meant to be human, to live, and to die. It was a confrontation with the very fabric of existence, an attempt to unravel the mystery that lay at the heart of life itself. And so, in Zurich, a city brimming with intellectual curiosity and uncertainty, Dr. Ludwig Schmid began his experiment, a daring, dangerous attempt to measure consciousness after death. His vision, bold and uncompromising, was one that would shake the foundations of science and philosophy, and in the end, it would leave more questions than answers. But the questions themselves, as haunting as they were, would become the legacy of his work, echoing across time and compelling future generations to continue the search for the elusive truth about life, death, and the nature of consciousness. Dr. Ludwig Schmid was a man whose intellect seemed both brilliant and troubled, a figure caught between the rigors of scientific pursuit and a deep, almost obsessive desire to understand the unfathomable mysteries of human existence. He wasn't the typical scientist of his time. While many of his peers were content to follow the well-worn paths of established disciplines, Schmid harbored a fascination that led him to the darker, unexplored corners of knowledge, places where science and spirituality collided. His mind, sharp and inquisitive, sought answers to questions that others either dared not ask or simply didn't believe could be answered. The nature of consciousness, the essence of what made a person truly alive, was his obsession. And in that obsession, Schmid found both clarity and confusion, brilliance and madness. Born into a world still in the grip of centuries-old traditions, Schmid's early years were shaped by a mix of rigorous education and the lingering shadows of superstition. The world was on the cusp of the modern age, but many of the age-old questions about the human soul, the afterlife, and the nature of consciousness had not been definitively answered. Schmid was raised in a time when religious dogma still had a stranglehold on the minds of many, especially in a city like Zurich, where spiritual beliefs shaped everyday life. For some, the soul was a divine spark, eternal and untouchable, destined for salvation or damnation depending on one's life choices. For others, consciousness was merely the result of a complex network of neural processes that began and ended with the body. But Schmid, from an early age, found neither of these explanations satisfying. It wasn't just an intellectual curiosity that drove Schmid, it was a deep personal desire to understand what happens at the very moment when life slips away and death takes its place. What was the connection between life and death? Was there truly a sharp line between the two, or was there something in between, something that could be measured, observed, and understood? His studies in the emerging field of physiology and medicine gave him a strong foundation in understanding the body systems, yet he quickly realized that no one had yet explored the one thing that truly separated living beings from non-living matter, consciousness. How could something so intangible, so elusive, exist and function so distinctly within the body? And more hauntingly, what happened to it when life ceased? Schmid was no mere academic. His was a passion driven by something deeper, a thirst to uncover the ultimate truth, even if that truth threatened to undermine the very foundations of existence as he knew it. While other scientists of the era sought to unravel the mysteries of the physical world, Schmid set his sights on something far more ephemeral: the mind, the soul, the consciousness that imbued each human being with awareness and sentience. He did not see the mind as something to be neatly categorized within the confines of the physical brain. To Schmid, consciousness was an active force, not just a passive byproduct of biological processes. It had a weight, a substance, something that could potentially be measured. At the heart of Schmid's thinking was the idea that death, as the most extreme and final process in the human experience, was the key to understanding consciousness. Death was more than just the cessation of biological functions. For Schmid, it represented the most profound transition a person could undergo, a journey from life to whatever lay beyond. If consciousness existed within the body, could it leave an imprint when it departed? Could the essence of life, of thought, awareness, and experience, be measured? He became obsessed with the idea that the moment of death might offer clues to the very nature of existence itself. If consciousness could be observed as it left the body, Schmid believed, it might be the breakthrough that would forever change humanity's understanding of life, death, and the soul. However, Schmid was also acutely aware of the skepticism that surrounded his ambitions. The scientific community of the late 19th century was not ready for such an audacious claim. Most scientists viewed death as the end of all biological activity, the moment when consciousness vanished entirely. The idea that consciousness could persist, even for a moment, beyond the body's death, was not only unconventional but outright controversial. Schmid's peers, deeply embedded in the traditions of scientific rigor, saw little value in entertaining such speculative questions. The focus of medicine at the time was on curing disease, understanding anatomy, and improving the human condition through practical applications of science. Mystical notions about the soul or consciousness after death had no place in the laboratory, and Schmid's theories were seen by many as little more than fanciful dreams, bordering on pseudoscience. But Schmid was not deterred. In fact, he seemed almost driven by the opposition. His deep-seated belief that humanity had only scratched the surface of understanding what it meant to live, and to die, pushed him to pursue his experiment regardless of the doubts that surrounded him. The more his colleagues dismissed his theories, the more determined Schmid became to prove them wrong. The challenge of it all became almost secondary to the pursuit of truth. Schmid was not content to merely follow the path that others had trodden. He was a man in search of answers to the most profound mysteries of existence. And so, Schmid began to gather evidence for his theory, piecing together fragments of knowledge from different fields. He studied anatomy, psychology, and emerging ideas in physiology, all while obsessively exploring the writings of those who had speculated about the soul, consciousness, and life after death. Many of the great philosophers had posited that consciousness was something separate from the body, an eternal, immaterial force that could not be explained through biology alone. Theologians had long argued that the soul was the seat of consciousness, and that it departed the body upon death, continuing its existence in another realm. But for Schmid, these explanations were insufficient. He needed something tangible, something measurable. And so he began to consider the possibility that the transition from life to death, that very moment when consciousness was thought to depart the body, might leave a physical trace. It was this central idea that became the foundation of his experiment. Schmid believed that at the moment of death, when the body ceased its functioning, something, the very essence of consciousness itself, would leave the body, potentially leaving behind a measurable change. Could it be that consciousness had a weight? Could it be that the soul, as some had speculated, could be quantified in a way that science could understand? Schmid's ambition wasn't merely theoretical. He was determined to test his hypothesis through a controlled experiment. To prove or disprove his idea, he needed a way to measure the most fleeting of moments, the precise moment when life left the body. And so, Schmid began to make plans. He knew that the heart of the experiment would lie in his ability to measure a change in the body's state upon death. He envisioned a simple yet powerful method, weighing the body before and after death to detect any loss of mass. The logic was clear. If consciousness, or the soul, had any kind of tangible weight, it should be detectable as the body transitioned from life to death. It was a radical, bold, and incredibly controversial idea, but Schmid, in his quest for truth, was undeterred by the enormity of the challenge. In those early days of planning, Schmid's obsession with his experiment grew. The more he considered the implications of his hypothesis, the more it seemed to consume him. He would speak of the experiment to anyone who would listen, even though most dismissed his ideas as fantastical. The subject of death was still taboo in many circles, and Schmid's willingness to delve into this most taboo of subjects only alienated him further from his colleagues. Yet for Schmid, the question of consciousness was too important to ignore. His research into the scientific understanding of death, what happened in the moments when the body ceased to function, was both theoretical and deeply personal. He saw his work as more than just an experiment. It was an attempt to answer the greatest of all human questions. What happens when we die? What is it that makes us us? And what becomes of that essence when life ends? It was these questions that kept Schmidt awake at night, and it was these questions that propelled him to move forward with his dangerous and controversial experiment. While Schmidt's ambition pushed him to the fringes of accepted scientific thought, it also brought him to a critical crossroads. If he succeeded, he would be the man who had uncovered the hidden truth of life and death, the one who had bridged the gap between the living and the dead. But if he failed, his work would be dismissed, his name forgotten, and his theories debunked. The stakes could not have been higher. For Schmidt, however, there was no turning back. He had already ventured too far into the unknown to retreat now. Driven by his belief that science could unravel the mysteries of the soul, Schmidt plunged headfirst into his experiment, prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him, no matter how grave. As the days turned into weeks and then months, Schmidt's vision began to take form. The experiment was not just about measuring consciousness, it was about confronting the greatest unknown of all. And in that confrontation, Schmidt hoped to find the answers that had eluded humanity for millennia. Dr. Ludwig Schmidt's experiment was about to reach the stage where his theories would either be confirmed or forever cast aside. The tools of the day, rudimentary yet innovative, would be the instruments through which he would attempt to measure something no one had dared measure before. For Schmidt, the task was not merely about observing death as a biological event, but about capturing the intangible essence of life itself, the consciousness, that momentary spark that defined a human being's existence. What was it that made a person who they were? Could it leave a trace? If so, could it be measured scientifically? These questions drove Schmidt forward, despite the skepticism that enveloped him like a thick fog. The method Schmidt settled on was deceptively simple yet ambitious in its premise. He had read the work of many before him who had attempted to measure or understand life beyond the biological, yet all these efforts had failed to produce conclusive answers. Theologians had spoken of the soul's departure from the body at death, but they could offer no proof. Philosophers had speculated about the afterlife, but their ideas were based on belief, not science. Schmidt, on the other hand, was determined to use the scientific tools of his time, tools that could offer concrete, observable data. If he was to prove his theory, he needed an approach that would be as rigorous and controlled as possible. After much consideration, Schmidt decided that the key to unlocking the mystery lay in measuring the weight of the body before and after death. He was inspired by earlier theories, most notably those of Dr. Duncan MacDougall, a physician who had conducted similar experiments in the early 20th century, though Schmidt's approach was more refined. MacDougall had suggested that the human body might lose a small amount of weight upon death, a theory that tied into the idea that the soul could have a physical presence. Though MacDougall's results were controversial and his methodology far less exact than Schmidt's, the notion had struck a chord with Schmidt. He envisioned a more controlled version of MacDougall's experiment, one that could yield more reliable results and, he hoped, a clearer answer. The key to Schmidt's approach lay in the measurement of the body's mass at the precise moment of death. He would need to weigh the subject both just before death and immediately after, ensuring that the timing of the measurements was as precise as possible. This would allow him to determine if any weight was lost during the transition from life to death. In his mind, this loss, however minute, could be the key to proving that consciousness, or something akin to it, had weight. This wasn't merely about measuring the body's decomposition or the release of air from the lungs, which would occur naturally in the process of dying. Schmidt was convinced that something more profound was at work, something that science had yet to uncover. He believed that the essence of life, consciousness itself, could leave a measurable imprint as it departed the body. The question was whether or not he could measure it. Schmidt's instruments, though primitive by modern standards, were adequate for the task he had in mind. He enlisted the use of a highly sensitive scale, one that could measure the tiniest fluctuations in weight. It wasn't the most advanced piece of equipment, but it would have to suffice. To ensure the accuracy of his measurements, Schmidt would carefully calibrate the scale before each subject's death, ensuring that no external factors, such as environmental changes or subtle shifts in the lab, would interfere with the readings. Precision was everything. Schmidt also employed thermometers to monitor the body's temperature, another variable that could offer insight into the physiological changes occurring at the moment of death. If the body's temperature dropped significantly after death, it could provide additional data about the cessation of life functions, although Schmidt was less interested in these changes than in the more elusive concept of consciousness. Schmidt knew that the experiment could only succeed if he had willing participants, volunteers who would subject themselves to the rigors of the experiment in the name of scientific discovery. Recruiting subjects, however, proved to be a challenge. The very idea of measuring the essence of consciousness was so bizarre, so outside the accepted norms of science at the time, that few were willing to take part. Yet Schmid, ever determined, managed to find a handful of volunteers, each with their own reasons for wanting to be involved in such an audacious experiment. Some were medical professionals, intrigued by the possibility of uncovering a new facet of human existence. Others were simply desperate men and women seeking a way to make a mark on history, a legacy that would endure beyond their own lifetimes. For each of them, the prospect of being part of such an unprecedented experiment was both frightening and exhilarating. They knew the risks, but they also understood the potential for greatness. The opportunity to contribute to an experiment that could reshape humanity's understanding of life and death was a rare and powerful draw. The first volunteer, a man of average stature and quiet demeanor, entered the lab with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. He had signed up for the experiment out of a combination of intellectual fascination and personal desperation. He had long been intrigued by the mysteries of life and death, and he hoped that by participating in Schmid's experiment, he might provide the missing piece of the puzzle. As he lay on the table, preparing for the moment when his life would slip away, he was acutely aware of the enormity of what was about to transpire. He understood that he was not merely participating in a medical experiment. He was about to confront the very limits of human understanding, to test whether there was more to life than just biology, and whether the spirit or consciousness truly existed as something beyond the physical. Schmid, for his part, was focused intently on his instruments. His heart raced with anticipation as the time drew nearer for the subject's final moments. The room was filled with an almost oppressive silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock, the rhythmic beating of Schmid's own heart, and the occasional rustling of papers. The scale sat quietly in the corner, ready to record the subject's final weight. Schmid adjusted the thermometer, making sure the readings were accurate, and double-checked the calibration of the scale. Everything had to be perfect. This was a pivotal moment, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to gather data that could change the course of history. He could feel the weight of the moment in every breath, every movement. The subject had been prepared, his vital signs monitored, and his state of consciousness carefully assessed. The final moments arrived, and Schmid stood poised to record the weight of the body. The subject's breathing slowed, becoming shallow, and then, with a final exhalation, he was gone. The room fell into an eerie stillness. Schmid, with a mix of professional detachment and personal excitement, swiftly turned to the scale. As he began to record the data, he noticed something unsettling. The weight did not drop significantly. There was a slight fluctuation, but it was far too minor to be definitive. A sense of confusion spread over him. Could it be that consciousness was not measurable in the way he had imagined? Could it be that his hypothesis was flawed? Schmid's mind raced. He knew that this was only the first test, but doubts began to creep in. The data was inconclusive, and the moment of death had not yielded the dramatic change he had hoped for. Was there something he had missed? Were there other factors at play, things that he hadn't accounted for in his experiment? Despite his meticulous planning, Schmid couldn't help but feel a sense of failure. It was a disheartening realization, but it was not the end of the road. He knew that science was a process of trial and error, and he was determined to continue. But for the moment, the first experiment had not provided the breakthrough he had hoped for. Schmid, ever the perfectionist, spent the following days reanalyzing the data, considering alternative explanations for the results. Perhaps, he thought, the scale was not sensitive enough. Or maybe the timing of the measurements was off. He began to entertain the possibility that the loss of consciousness did not produce a noticeable change in weight, at least not one that could be detected by the methods he was using. He also wondered if the subject's final moments had been too brief, too swift, for the kind of measurable shift he was looking for. In any case, Schmid's resolve remained firm. The data was inconclusive, but it was not a failure. It was merely the beginning. His experiment, despite the initial setback, was far from over. And as the days wore on, Schmid knew that he would have to push even harder, dig even deeper, to uncover the truth. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the cusp of something great, something that could shatter the boundaries of science and change humanity's understanding of the most fundamental questions of existence. The road ahead would be long, but Schmid was undeterred. The experiment was not yet finished. The days following the first experiment were filled with a mixture of frustration and determination for Dr. Ludwig Schmid. The data from the initial test had not provided the clarity he had hoped for. There had been no significant loss of weight, no dramatic change that would indicate the departure of consciousness from the body. At first glance, the results seemed to mock the very theory he had worked so tirelessly to develop. But Schmid was not a man to be easily deterred. He understood the nature of scientific inquiry better than most. Progress was rarely linear, and every failure held the seed of future discovery. He had no intention of abandoning his pursuit, not when he was so close to the answers that haunted him. With a sense of renewed resolve, Schmid turned inward. He had long since accepted that his experiment was not just a test of physical phenomena, it was also a test of his own patience and conviction. He had not expected success on the first try, nor would he let a small setback overshadow the greater potential of what he was attempting. He needed to refine his methods, to reconsider the very assumptions that had guided his experiment thus far. The questions that lay at the heart of his research, what is consciousness, and how could it be measured, were as elusive as ever, but Schmid had a deeper understanding of the stakes. This was not just an academic exercise. This was a journey into the most profound mysteries of human existence. One of the first things Schmid considered was the method by which he had conducted the experiment. The scale, although sensitive, may not have been precise enough to detect even the slightest fluctuations in weight. It had been the best available tool for his purposes, but Schmid now wondered whether the tools of his time were too crude to measure something as intangible as consciousness. He began to think about the very nature of what he was trying to measure. Consciousness, after all, was not a simple material phenomenon. It was something that could not be neatly quantified in physical terms. If consciousness was truly a spiritual force, as some had believed, then how could it leave behind a physical trace that could be detected by mere instruments? Schmid wrestled with this thought, wondering if perhaps the experiment itself was based on a misunderstanding of what consciousness truly was. Was it possible that the essence of life could not be measured, not because it wasn't real, but because it was beyond the reach of human tools and methods? Despite these doubts, Schmid's commitment to his experiment remained unwavering. He knew that if there was any truth to his hypothesis, it would not be revealed through a single test or a single method. Science, after all, was a gradual process, a continual refinement of ideas and techniques. Schmid's early experiences had taught him that he would have to persist, to try again, and to remain open to the possibility that the answers might not come in the form he expected. He began to reevaluate his approach, refining the experiment and considering new variables that might yield more meaningful results. He decided to conduct the experiment again, but this time, he would make adjustments to his methodology. He chose a different volunteer, a woman this time, with the hope that the different biological and physiological characteristics might reveal something new. Schmid also made modifications to his equipment, upgrading the scale to one with greater precision, ensuring that every possible factor that could interfere with the results was minimized. He calibrated the scale again and again, performing test runs to ensure that no outside forces, such as temperature fluctuations or vibrations in the room, could influence the measurements. This time, he would be meticulous beyond measure. He would leave no stone unturned. The volunteer was an older woman, one who had experienced considerable suffering from a long-term illness. She had come to Schmid's laboratory at the suggestion of a local physician, who, intrigued by Schmid's work, had recommended her as a subject for the experiment. The woman, though frail and weary, was calm, even eager, to participate. She had lived a long life, and in some ways, she seemed to welcome the idea of contributing to something that could shed light on the mysteries of life and death. Perhaps, in some way, she hoped that her participation would offer her a sense of purpose, an opportunity to leave behind a legacy that transcended her physical suffering. As Schmid prepared for the second experiment, the room seemed more charged with tension than before. The weight of expectation hung heavily in the air. Would this time be different? Would the data finally provide the breakthrough Schmid had been so desperately seeking? He was acutely aware of the risks, of course. The previous experiment had failed to yield any clear results, and there was no guarantee that this time would be any different. And yet, there was something about the woman's presence, something about the quiet dignity with which she approached the experiment, that gave Schmid a sense of purpose and determination. She was willing to be a part of something larger than herself, to sacrifice her final moments in the name of discovery. In many ways, this act of participation embodied the very spirit of scientific inquiry, a willingness to embrace uncertainty in pursuit of a greater truth. As the woman lay on the table, her body weak but her mind still sharp, Schmid prepared to monitor her vital signs once more. He noted her breathing, her heart rate, and her overall condition. There was an almost clinical detachment in his observations, but beneath that exterior, Schmid could feel the weight of the moment. This experiment, whether it succeeded or failed, was a confrontation with something beyond the realm of science. It was a confrontation with the very nature of existence itself. The line between life and death was a thin one, and Schmid could not help but wonder if, in this experiment, he was witnessing the moment when the very essence of what it meant to be human slipped away. As the minutes passed, Schmid's anticipation grew, his hands steady but his thoughts racing. He adjusted the scale once more, ensuring that everything was in perfect alignment. The volunteer's breathing began to slow, and soon, her heart rate followed suit. Schmid noted the drop in her vital signs, observing the moment of transition with a mix of scientific focus and personal reverence. This was the moment when life would slip away and death would take its place. Schmid's fingers hovered over the scale as he prepared to record the readings. Time seemed to stretch, and every second felt like an eternity. As the woman took her final breath, Schmid swiftly turned to the scale, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent except for the faint rustle of papers and the ticking of the clock. Schmid's eyes were fixed on the needle of the scale, willing it to move. The seconds passed, and the scale began to register a small fluctuation in weight. It was not much, hardly enough to be considered conclusive, but it was something. The needle shifted, ever so slightly, as the body's transition from life to death unfolded before Schmid's eyes. He recorded the data with a sense of quiet triumph, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this be the proof he had been searching for? The woman's body was still, her vital signs now absent. Schmid knew that there was no more data to be gathered, but the small change in weight, though insignificant in the grand scheme of things, was enough to ignite a spark of hope. It wasn't a grand revelation, but it was a step forward, a glimmer of something that might one day be fully understood. For Schmid, the experiment had not failed. It had opened a new door, one that would require further exploration and refinement. After the second experiment, Schmid sat alone in his laboratory, reviewing the results once again. He could not afford to be satisfied with just a small fluctuation in weight. He knew that the true answer would require further experimentation, more subjects, and perhaps even a deeper understanding of the forces at play. And yet, there was a part of him that felt a quiet sense of validation. The fluctuation in weight, no matter how slight, suggested that consciousness might indeed have a measurable presence, even if that presence was too subtle to detect with the methods of the time. The failure of the first experiment had been disheartening, but it had been a necessary step toward understanding. In some ways, the first failure had pushed Schmid to refine his methods, to consider new possibilities, and to dig deeper into the unknown. The results from the second experiment were not definitive, but they were promising. And so, Schmid pressed on, determined to continue his search for the elusive truth. The path ahead was still unclear, but Schmid knew one thing for certain. He would not stop until he had uncovered the answer to the question that had haunted him for so long. What happens when we die? What is the true nature of consciousness? He would continue his work, unyielding in his quest for discovery, knowing that each experiment, each test, brought him one step closer to understanding the most profound mystery of human existence. As Dr. Ludwig Schmid continued his pursuit of the elusive answer to the question of consciousness after death, he found himself more and more entrenched in a delicate dance between science and speculation. His earlier experiments had yielded faint, barely perceptible results, nothing conclusive, nothing that could be considered definitive proof. But the slight fluctuations he had observed, though insignificant in the broader scope of his hypothesis, were enough to sustain his hope. Schmid was far from satisfied, but he was no longer disillusioned. He recognized that the journey to understanding consciousness was not a sprint but a marathon, and like all great scientific endeavors, it would require patience, resilience, and, above all, an unwavering commitment to discovery. Schmid knew that the road ahead would not be easy. He had encountered skepticism from the very beginning, and he had no doubt that the scientific community would continue to dismiss his work as misguided. After all, the very idea that consciousness could have a measurable weight seemed absurd to many. It challenged the very foundations of biology, neuroscience, and philosophy. Consciousness was supposed to be a product of the brain, a complex network of neurons firing in precise patterns. It was thought to be inherently linked to the body, a phenomenon that began with life and ended with death. The idea that consciousness could persist beyond death, that it could leave a trace of any kind, was not only controversial but viewed by many as an affront to the prevailing scientific understanding. Despite this, Schmid remained resolute in his conviction. The results he had observed so far, however faint and inconclusive, were enough to suggest that there was something more at play, something that science had yet to uncover. He could not ignore the possibility that he was on the cusp of a discovery that could change everything. The questions he was grappling with, questions about life, death, and consciousness, were not just theoretical musings. They were questions that struck at the heart of human existence itself. What was the essence of life? What was the nature of the soul? And could science ever hope to answer these questions? Schmid's resolve to continue his work was also fueled by a growing sense of responsibility. He understood that he was not merely conducting an experiment for the sake of intellectual curiosity. His work had the potential to reshape humanity's understanding of existence. If he succeeded, he would not only be remembered as a scientist who had unlocked one of the greatest mysteries of life, but he would also have made a contribution to human knowledge that would resonate for generations to come. But if he failed, his work would be dismissed, forgotten, and perhaps even ridiculed. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. With these thoughts in mind, Schmid began to refine his approach once again. He realized that the experiment needed to be more than just a simple measurement of weight. The changes that occurred at the moment of death were far too subtle to be captured by the instruments he had been using. He needed to account for more variables, to find a way to measure consciousness in a way that went beyond the limits of physical science. Schmid had always believed that the essence of life, consciousness, was more than just a product of the brain's activity. He believed it was something deeper, something that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world. But how could he prove it? How could he capture something so intangible, so fleeting, and so profound? It was during this period of reflection that Schmid began to consider the idea of energy. Energy, he realized, was a fundamental force in the universe. It was the driving force behind all physical processes, from the beating of the heart to the firing of neurons in the brain. Energy could be measured, quantified, and understood. But could it explain consciousness? Could the departure of consciousness from the body be understood in terms of energy? Schmid's mind raced as he explored this new avenue of thought. He began to study the work of other scientists who had delved into the nature of energy, particularly in relation to the human body. He read extensively about the role of electrical impulses in the brain and nervous system, as well as the more abstract theories about the energy that might reside within the human soul. Could the energy of consciousness, as some had speculated, be measurable at the moment of death? Could it be captured, perhaps as a change in the body's electrical field or the release of some other form of energy? To Schmid, this idea was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was exhilarating because it offered a new way to think about the experiment, a way to approach consciousness from a completely different angle. But it was also terrifying because it would require new methods, new instruments, and a deeper understanding of the very nature of life itself. Schmid had always prided himself on his precision, but this new avenue of inquiry would take him into uncharted territory. He was no longer just measuring weight. He was attempting to measure something that had no clear definition, no established parameters. Determined to pursue this new line of thought, Schmid sought the help of other scientists and engineers who might be able to assist him in measuring the kind of energy he believed could be linked to consciousness. He reached out to colleagues in the fields of physics and electromagnetism, hoping to find a way to measure the subtle electrical currents that might be associated with life and death. While many of them were skeptical of his theory, some were intrigued by the possibility that there might be more to life and death than the physical body could explain. One of the individuals who showed the most interest in Schmid's ideas was a young physicist named Klaus Adler. Adler was fascinated by Schmid's work, and he quickly became a valuable ally in the pursuit of the experiment's success. Together, they began to develop a new set of instruments designed to measure the subtle energy changes that might occur during the moment of death. These instruments would be more sophisticated than the simple scales Schmid had used before. They would include sensitive detectors of electromagnetic fields, devices that could measure minute fluctuations in the body's energy signature, and instruments designed to capture any residual electrical impulses that might be left behind after death. Adler's contribution was invaluable, as his knowledge of electromagnetism and energy helped Schmid refine his understanding of the forces at play in the human body. The human body, Adler explained, was a complex network of electrical systems, from the nervous system to the muscles and organs. At the moment of death, these electrical impulses ceased. But what if there was more to it? What if the cessation of these electrical signals released a form of energy that could be detected? Schmid's hypothesis began to take shape in a new way, with the energy of consciousness becoming the focal point of their experiment. They would measure not only the body's weight but also any changes in the electromagnetic fields surrounding the body. The new instruments were a marvel of innovation, a fusion of Schmid's determination and Adler's expertise in physics. As the two men worked together, They began to refine the experiment's methodology, accounting for the various variables that could affect the results. The room where the experiments were conducted was carefully calibrated to minimize external influences. There would be no drafts, no temperature fluctuations, and no sources of electromagnetic interference. The instruments were carefully aligned, and Schmid made sure to explain the purpose of the experiment to the volunteers with even greater detail this time. Each person who entered the laboratory knew the stakes. This was not just an experiment to measure weight or electrical impulses. This was a test of something far more profound. The first volunteer for this new phase of the experiment was an elderly man, well into his 70s, who had long suffered from a degenerative illness. He had been informed of the nature of the experiment and had agreed to participate out of a sense of curiosity, as well as a desire to contribute to something greater than himself. Schmid and Adler carefully monitored his vital signs as the man lay on the table, prepared for the moment when he would pass from life to death. The room was filled with an almost palpable tension as Schmid and Adler watched the instruments, hoping that the new measurements would reveal something meaningful. As the man's life slipped away, Schmid and Adler focused their attention on the instruments, their eyes fixed on the readings. The changes were subtle at first, no dramatic shift in weight or sudden release of energy. But as the moments passed, Schmid and Adler both began to notice a faint, barely perceptible change in the electromagnetic field around the body. It was not enough to be definitive, but it was more than they had observed in the previous experiment. There was a shift, a small, but noticeable change in the energy surrounding the body at the moment of death. This was the breakthrough that Schmid had been waiting for. While the results were not conclusive, they were enough to suggest that there was something to his hypothesis. The energy associated with consciousness, it seemed, might indeed leave an imprint at the moment of death. It was not the kind of dramatic revelation Schmid had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. With this new data in hand, Schmid felt a surge of hope. The journey was far from over, but he knew that this was the beginning of something profound. He had caught a glimpse of the truth, and now he was more determined than ever to unravel the mystery of consciousness, this time with the power of both science and energy on his side. The breakthrough that Schmid had witnessed during his latest experiment, though not as dramatic as he had hoped, ignited a fire within him that could not be easily extinguished. The faint fluctuations in the electromagnetic field surrounding the body at the moment of death were enough to fuel his curiosity and determination. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a trace of something, an energy that seemed to mark the boundary between life and death. Schmid was now convinced that he was on the right track, but he also knew that he had only just begun to scratch the surface of a much deeper mystery. For Schmid, this wasn't just about proving a point or making a name for himself. It was about confronting the most fundamental question that humanity had grappled with for centuries. What happens after death? Was consciousness truly bound to the body, or did it exist independently, lingering in some form beyond the physical realm? The results of the experiment, while promising, were far from definitive. They raised more questions than they answered. What exactly was this energy that seemed to linger after death? Was it a mere byproduct of the body's cessation of function, or did it represent something more profound, something that transcended the physical realm? Schmid found himself wrestling with these questions, and yet he was more determined than ever to press forward. He had seen something that no one else had seen, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the electromagnetic field surrounding the body. It was not much, but it was enough to suggest that consciousness might have a measurable energy signature, something that could persist even after death. To Schmid, this was the beginning of a new frontier in the study of life, death, and consciousness. The next phase of Schmid's experiment would require an even more rigorous approach. He could no longer rely solely on measurements of weight and basic electromagnetic fields. If he was to uncover the true nature of the energy he had detected, he would need to expand the scope of his investigation. Schmid began to consult with a wider array of experts, physicists, biologists, and even metaphysicists who had long pondered the relationship between consciousness and the universe. He sought out new technologies that might allow him to probe deeper into the phenomenon he had only begun to understand. Schmid understood that he was venturing into uncharted territory, and in doing so, he would need to draw from every available source of knowledge. This was no longer just a scientific experiment. It was a philosophical and spiritual quest to understand the very nature of existence. In his conversations with Adler, Schmid began to explore the idea that consciousness might be a form of energy that existed outside the confines of the body's biological systems. Perhaps it wasn't just a product of neural activity, as many of Schmid's contemporaries had suggested. Perhaps it was something more, an energy field that transcended the physical, something that could leave a trace even after the body had ceased to function. The question that Schmid had been grappling with for so long had now evolved into a broader inquiry. If consciousness could persist after death, how could it be understood in terms of energy? Could the energy of consciousness be quantified and studied like any other form of energy in the universe? Schmid and Adler spent countless hours poring over scientific papers, theories, and the latest developments in fields like quantum physics and bioelectromagnetics. The more they read, the more they realized that the concept of consciousness as an energy field was not as far-fetched as it had once seemed. In fact, there were already some scientists and philosophers who had speculated about the existence of an energy-based consciousness, suggesting that it might be linked to the brain's electromagnetic activity. Schmid found himself drawn to the idea that consciousness was not just a product of the brain, but a phenomenon that could be understood as part of the larger fabric of the universe. This new perspective on consciousness opened up a wealth of possibilities, and Schmid was determined to explore them all. As Schmid and Adler worked together, they began to refine their instruments even further, expanding their toolkit to include more sophisticated technologies that could detect even the most subtle energy fluctuations. One of the key advancements they made was the development of an ultra-sensitive bioelectromagnetic detector, capable of picking up faint changes in the body's electromagnetic field with unprecedented accuracy. This new instrument allowed Schmid to observe the energy signatures of the body in greater detail than ever before. They also incorporated infrared thermography, which allowed them to measure changes in the body's heat signature, and a range of other sensors that could detect fluctuations in the electromagnetic spectrum. Schmid was now armed with a set of tools that could potentially allow him to measure the energy of consciousness with a degree of precision that had never been possible before. The next phase of experimentation was set to begin, and Schmid knew that it would require even greater care and attention to detail. The stakes were higher than ever. If the new instruments could detect the energy of consciousness as Schmid believed, then he would have solid evidence that consciousness existed independently of the body, that it could persist beyond death. If he succeeded, it would be a breakthrough that would change the course of science, philosophy, and even spirituality. But the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. Schmid had learned from experience that even the slightest error could invalidate the results of the experiment. Every variable had to be accounted for, every measurement taken with the utmost precision. This time, Schmid and Adler decided to include a wider range of volunteers, each with varying ages and health conditions. They wanted to see if there were any differences in the energy signatures of individuals, based on factors such as age, health, or even the nature of their illness. Would the energy of consciousness manifest differently in a healthy individual compared to someone suffering from a terminal illness? Could the energy signatures be influenced by the person's state of mind or emotional condition? These were questions that Schmid had never considered before, but he knew that the answers could provide valuable insights into the nature of consciousness itself.